represented a client whose wife was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th and didn't go anywhere near the Capitol complex, but somehow she was mistakenly marked as a domestic terrorist. Being a whistleblower and coming forward is a very risky road. There are very high chances that you get retaliated against. Bank of America had just handed over to the FBI without a warrant all of the information from any one of its customers who was anywhere in the D.C. area. Why are we going after everyday Americans?
Our founding fathers here in this country brought about the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and the ability to determine our own destiny. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
The Founding Fathers were big fans of keeping the government accountable, but accountability has seemingly gone out of the window the longer nations existed. And now in the past few years, the biggest way to keep our nation accountable has come through whistleblowers. So here to talk about a lot of the whistleblowers, a lot of big cases going on now with Tulsi Gabbard and the air marshals, the FBI cases, even Hunter Biden and the IRS, none other than President of Empower Oversight and candidate for West Virginia House of Delegates, Tristan Leavitt.
Hey, Christian, thanks for having me.
Good to have you, Tristan. So Sunday night, the news broke about Tulsi Gabbard. Really, every time she flies, she's surrounded by, was it 4 or 5 different members of the federal government just to spy on her, basically. So walk us through what's going on with that and Quiet Skies program, as I hear in the federal marshal program. What's going on?
Yeah, so the Quiet Skies program is one that's attracted a lot of controversy in the past, but it's, TSA and the Federal Air Marshal Service, which is located within TSA, have struggled over time to figure out how best to focus their resources. And so one of the things that TSA started doing in 2012 was to use kind of different rules or different formulas to see out of all those who are flying where they should maybe try and target for additional resources. Again, it was accused of being misused. A lot of reporting came out in 2018 because unlike if someone is identified as a potential terrorist, as a known terrorist, of course, there's the no-fly list. Most people have heard about that before, and there are various terrorist databases. And so in those instances, someone who is suspected of being a terrorist, even if they're not on a no-fly list, then they would have a lot of surveillance on them. Well, Quiet Skies attracted attention because it's not even for people that had, that there was any real reason to suspect other than just that they kind of got flagged in this system for enhanced surveillance. So we've seen it happen in the past. 2 years ago, we represented a client, Empower Oversight, who wanted to be quiet at the time, but whose wife was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th of 2021 and didn't go anywhere near the Capitol complex, but somehow she was mistakenly put into a system as having been, inside the Capitol. So she was marked as a domestic terrorist. And so she was, whenever she flew, she would have all this enhanced security she had to go through, and then additional air marshals on the flight. And her husband actually worked for the air marshals in an operational capacity. So he saw her name come up and said, what am I supposed to do with this? So he went to his supervisor, said, this is wrong. She wasn't there. They told him, don't worry about it. It's not our investigation. So ultimately, that wasn't stopped at the time, even though we Senator Ron Johnson from the U.S. Senate wrote about that, didn't have any impact. So now that it's come out that Tulsi Gabbard has also been receiving this enhanced surveillance, and hers is, she's not marked as a suspected terrorist or anything else. It's just under Quiet Skies. So there's really no reason for her to have this kind of additional surveillance, as far as we're aware. Obviously, if the air marshals comes back and they want to somehow justify this, that's on them. But from what we've seen, there's no reason. And so, yeah, at least 3 to 4 or 5 individuals will be part of additional screening. They send out 2 teams of bomb sniffing dogs whenever she travels to the airport. And then on every flight that she's been on, she's had at least 3 plainclothes air marshals flying there with her just purely to keep an eye on her. And it's pretty outrageous.
And she's not going to be the only one who's under the Quiet Skies program. She's just one of the first that we're finding out about now. And you're saying the only reason she's a part of the program now is because she was at J6? Is that correct?
No, sorry. So I'm I'm mixing up. We're conflating kind of two different things. So one person we represented 2 years ago, his wife was in D.C. She went to hear President Trump speak. She went, when we say at J6, right? Usually people
Yeah.
talk about being inside the Capitol. She wasn't anywhere near the Capitol. So he had to fight, and his wife had to fight for 2 years to try and get her name taken off that list. Now we see that even though we flagged that to the Inspector General at the time of the Department of Homeland Security saying this is an abuse, clearly they're not doing a good job of managing this system, the Inspector General didn't take any action. And so now we're learning that it also swept up Tulsi Gabbard. So two different people, two different cases, but both examples of where it seems to be a real misuse of resources, especially when the Secret Service doesn't seem to have enough money to provide protection for former President Trump, right? There's money woes all around, but here the marshals are putting so much effort, so many resources into these cases. It really seems like, gross waste and an abuse of authority for the TSA.
So what's happened over the past 2 years since your clients first brought this forward? They found any resolution? What's the path forward for Tulsi over the next 2 years, whatever it takes?
Sure. So the ones in the last couple of years, although the Inspector General didn't help them at all, they did ultimately connect with the FBI and say, hey, this seems to be a mistake, and they were able to get the wife off of there. That individual is still kind of blowing the whistle on the program, saying, hey, clearly there are mistakes in here sometimes. So we sent a letter to that effect yesterday to the Inspector General, and I think there will be a lot of reporting on that in the days to come. For Tulsi, it's not clear because, again, there is even less of a reason to believe that, this isn't just a mistake of they thought she was somewhere, January 6th. From what we can tell, there's no reason for her to be on this list whatsoever. So she's going to start speaking about that quite a bit, I understand. And again, we are working with other whistleblowers who desire to come forward to make sure that they can make these disclosures to Congress and to the Inspector General about the problems, the abuses with this program. So our goal will be to help keep them protected during that time. Being a whistleblower and coming forward is a very risky road, right? You stick your neck out. There are very high chances that you get retaliated against. You could potentially lose your career, but that's what these courageous people do. They, it's really an act of conscience from my perspective as a person of faith, right? They feel so strongly that it's important that the truth be told that they go out there and they risk their careers and their livelihood just to make sure that the truth gets out there.
And Tulsi's not just a whistleblower when it comes to the Federal Air Marshal Quiet Skies program. I mean, she's really a whistleblower when it comes to the DNC as a whole Democratic Party having walked away and all of that a couple years ago. Perhaps that would explain why she's on these lists now. They just don't like her. But you're just on Tucker a few weeks ago, like right before I met you in D.C. Tell us about the FBI cases you were talking about on Tucker's program and explaining to him. What kind of whistleblowers have come forth?
Sure. So there have been a lot of whistleblowers from the FBI over the last several years, and a lot of it has had to do, of course, the FBI got some real black eyes in the late 2010s, right, with their role in using, as part of Russiagate, relying on a discredited FISA warrant as a major predicate for opening that case. So you'd seen some of that already, but the real concerns with politicization happened after January 6th when, just less than a month after that, the director of the FBI came and testified on Capitol Hill and said that the FBI, he left the impression that there were not any informants from the FBI present. Senator Amy Klobuchar was questioning him and asked about that and said, wouldn't it be nice if we'd had some way of knowing ahead of time what was going to happen? And he kind of just sidestepped the question. And eventually later we learned they did have informants there, right? But so a lot of folks within the FBI objected to how it was approaching the cases there. One whistleblower came forward and said that, for instance, Bank of America had just handed over to the FBI without a warrant, without a subpoena, anything, handed over all of the information from any one of its customers who was anywhere in the DC area. You could have gone to Bowie, Maryland on January 5th to visit your sister-in-law, and all of that information from January 5th, 6th, and 7th was all handed over to the FBI and was part of, they looked through all of that to try and figure out opening all these investigations. So again, a lot of FBI agents and other employees felt really uncomfortable with that. Said, this isn't what we're here to do. We're here to fight crime. We're here to stop terrorism. That's fine. But why are we going after everyday Americans who may have had no connection with any of the events of January 6th? And even if they were, say present outside the Capitol, or even those, some who were inside the Capitol, right? There have been a lot of questions about what role how hard the government should come down on those individuals, depending on what their role was in all of it. Well, several of these whistleblowers with very just different experiences, but in different ways, kind of all raised questions about the FBI's role. One in particular, named Marcus Allen, is someone that the public has heard a lot about, but I testified alongside three of them in the spring of 2023 in front of the then new weaponization subcommittee. So Chairman Jim Jordan was chairing that. So it was Marcus Allen, another FBI whistle named Garrett O'Boyle, and then Steve Friend, three of them and me. And it seemed clear that each of their cases, they had their security clearances suspended because the FBI, seemed to both be retaliated against them for the disclosures. And what's more, it seemed like very politicized retaliation, right? You don't share the groupthink, and so we're going to go after you. And so what we learned right before I went on Tucker Carlson was that part of the interviews for the FBI's cases they were doing involved asking them, FBI employees, about their political views. So another client that we represent, whose identity has not been made public, he was present at the Capitol on January 6th, didn't go inside, but he got jammed up with the FBI. They went to multiple of his coworkers, and they asked them, they said, do you know this individual? Have you ever socialized with them outside of work, right? So they're asking for any context they know. And they asked, have you ever heard him vocalize support for former President Donald Trump? The FBI has no business knowing that of any of its employees, much less the security division, which is who administers holding security clearances. And they are asking this as part of a proceeding to see whether to take away this person's security clearance, which they ultimately did. Another question they asked was, have you ever heard him vocalize objection to the COVID-19 vaccine? Again, none of the FBI's business at that point. There had been a mandate for all FBI employees to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. And that's actually what seems to have kind of sifted out some of the FBI employees, that those that were skeptical of receiving the vaccine, FBI management kind of really trained their focus on them, right? And there seems to have been kind of an effort to push some of those people out in whatever way. But, I led a federal agency in the executive branch and during COVID-19. And when the COVID-19 mandate came out, we were instructed, and we were very careful with who would inquire about that information. It is protected medical information. So rather than having just everyone's supervisor ask them whether they've received the vaccine, this kind of information was supposed to only go to like certain individuals and be very protected. But the FBI has its security division asking about this, and people's security clearances, which essentially means their livelihood, hinged on this. If you don't have a security clearance, you can't do the job, and you can't work for another agency either. So that was very significant, we thought. Since being on Tucker, we've learned even further. We've had whistleblowers come forward from inside of the FBI security division. So even though it was pretty clear to us from the outside that they were retaliating against these folks, it turns out that there were people within the security division who was saying, the way you're treating these guys isn't right. And then those people within the security division were further retaliated against. So Marcus Allen, one FBI employee who we helped to get his security clearance reinstated this year, there were three different people within the security division at different stages of his case who all said, no, his clearance shouldn't be suspended. No, his clearance shouldn't be revoked. It should be given back. And we were ultimately able to get it back. But again, the fact that three different people were retaliated against behind the scenes, is pretty telling of the FBI and the culture of retaliation that exists there.
And this isn't just like a job application where, say, Marcus is going to apply to go work in the FBI. Marcus is already employed by the FBI, and they want to limit him and what he can do for the FBI because he voted for Trump or he didn't get the vaccine, correct?
That's what those questions were. Now, their reason, right, what they said was, the thing that Marcus blew the whistle on was when the New York Times reported in 2021 that there were informants present at the Capitol, Marcus forwarded that around to his chain of command. He was in the Charlotte, North Carolina field office. He said, hey, it looks like FBI leadership hasn't been forthcoming. That's what got him on the security suspicion radar, because he called into question the testimony of Director Chris Wray, which of course is a protected whistleblower disclosure. We want people to come forward where there's waste, fraud, or abuse. If people are lying, public officials, right? So that's why those whistleblower protections are in place. Then once he got within that suspicion funnel, then they started looking for any way they could to get at him. And so, yeah, they were asking questions about whether or not he received the vaccine. Those questions about Trump came up. It's telling that they knew it was inappropriate because that's not what they put in his letter suspending his security clearance. That's not what they put in the letter revoking his security clearance. They talk in that only about him being a potential security threat and don't say that they're considering inappropriate medical data or political, personal views. So all of that is indicative of the culture that there has been in the FBI, and the ways that it's really been kind of, weaponized against its own employees to take those people that thought a different way from the administration and to push them out.
And I know you talked to constitutional firms about this. What ways does this violate simply the First Amendment related to government employees? I know in a lot of ways they work for the government, so they just do what the government tells them to do. And the First Amendment exists for a reason, protect them from the government. So how is this conflicting there?
Yeah, it's a fine line in some ways, but there's a lot of Supreme Court precedent on how those interact. Because, like you say, I have, if you take out the government, I have a First Amendment right to say what I want, right? But if I generally, there are some caveats. I have to always, as a lawyer, add that, right? You can't yell, say fire in a crowded space, or
there's limits,
put people into the danger. Yeah, but as a general matter, the First Amendment is one of the key freedoms in our nation, and it's one of the things that helps keep the government in check. So it plays a very important role. It was seminal at the founding. You look at some of the key instances in the early colonial times where that was helpful to keep government in check, and so the framers of the Constitution understood very well how important this was. Looking then at what happens when someone, again, if I have an employer, I don't necessarily have a right to say whatever I want to them. If they dislike that, they in many instances may be able to fire me. The federal government is not too different from that, but the Supreme Court precedent kind of looks at what times are you speaking as an employee, so speaking perhaps on behalf of the government, versus when are you just speaking up in your private capacity as a private citizen. And so, you have these instances where, again, someone's political views have nothing to do with carrying out the job. There are people of all different political persuasions inside the FBI. So anything that they say on that, as long as it doesn't violate the Hatch Act, which prohibits campaigning while in the office or kind of using the authority of the federal government to promote certain candidates, it's really not the government's business. And so, again, there are First Amendment claims there. The again, kind of challenge to an extent is that, especially when you get into kind of whistleblower stuff, that sometimes that's First Amendment, and sometimes it is in your official capacity. So you'd say, well, it's not really a First Amendment issue. It's just I spoke up about what I saw was wrong. So even if the First Amendment doesn't protect that, Congress has chosen to with its whistleblower protections, right? And so that's an instance. So again, some cases are more First Amendment, some cases are more whistleblower protection, but in any of them, you just see a common thread where the government doesn't have the right to just, fire someone or suspend their security clearance just because they feel like it, right? People are entitled to due process under the law. It's another constitutional guarantee. And, although there's some case law that I don't know is necessarily the right way to have been decided, but that views having a federal job is actually a property right. Once I've been given that job, right, then I can't just be deprived of that property right without due process, without certain hearings and other things like that. And so those requirements apply to the government here as well. And a security clearance is one of the easiest ways to get out of that, because the amount of due process that's afforded is very limited. They just have the right ways to strip someone of that. People don't have a lot of recourse. The government just really holds the cards, because we do normally want to protect our classified information. And so the government's afforded a lot of latitude. And clearly in this case, the FBI abused that latitude.
Well, rather, the government, as the founders intended, doesn't have the authority to go after these people. We obviously know the government today is much different than any of the founders wanted to. They'd be rolling over in the grave today. But I'm from Delaware. It's Joe Biden's home state. Hunter Biden's often here. Joe just left yesterday to go back to D.C. What's going on in these Hunter Biden cases? I know you've had a couple whistleblowers come forward and try to expose that. Our state chair here in the Delaware Republican Party is actually very involved in the Hunter Biden stuff going on. She was one of the first to expose it when it came out with the laptop from hell guy up there in northern Delaware. What's going on from your perspective?
Yeah, so a year ago and some change, we, Empower Oversight, represented an IRS agent named Gary Shapley, and he was the supervisor of the IRS's investigation into Hunter Biden. And he had an experience over several years where first, all of the normal investigative steps that they would have taken in that case, his supervisors and the Delaware Attorney's Office really stopped them from taking those steps. They really slow rolled a lot of it. They told them to wait. A lot of it got pushed until after the 2020 election. And so that was a significant thing that, was really disconcerting to him and the case agent at the time, a guy named Joe Ziegler. Then as things moved forward, eventually they got through the investigative stage. They identified the charges they were going to bring. They weren't allowed to ask questions about Joe Biden along the way. By the way, they were only said, you can only ask about Hunter, don't ask about the dad, don't ask about the big guy. So again, they were really limited in their investigation, but eventually they came up with charges against Hunter Biden that the IRS signed off on, that the U.S. Attorney's Office signed off on. The FBI was supportive. And when Joe Biden became president, you had Attorney General Merrick Garland out there saying there's no conflict of interest. This sitting U.S. attorney was appointed by President Trump, and he's going to be able to continue with the investigation. Well, again, it was the employees of this sitting U.S. attorney who were limiting what the investigators could do, for one. The U.S. attorney, David Weiss, was a compromise candidate. You have to have the support of the home state senators usually to get a U.S. attorney appointed. Both the Delaware senators are Democrats. So David Weiss was really just a career employee, not a Republican in a meaningful way. And which, again, would be irrelevant other than his staff were interfering with this. And then Merrick Garland is out there touting that as such a sign of investigative independence, right? He's going to be able to do what he needs to do. He can bring these cases. He doesn't need anything else from the Biden administration. Well, it turns out that he did, in fact, need that. If he wanted to charge his cases, charge Hunter Biden anywhere else outside of Delaware, he had to get the permission of the U.S. attorney in those other states. And most of the charges against Hunter Biden from leading up to 2015 and 2016 were in D.C., where he was living while his dad was vice president. Then he moved to California. And so after that, from 17 onwards, they were in the East Central District of California. And the U.S. attorney, David Weiss, didn't have the authority to bring those cases. And at one point, he told the whistleblowers that there's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. So that's part of what they brought forward to Congress last year. Since then, because of them coming forward, it really influenced how DOJ acted around the case. Before they came forward, literally nothing was happening with the Hunter Biden case. It could have just sat with no movement whatsoever. When they started to come forward, before the substance was released, but again, they had already spoken up about this. They'd already blown the whistle inside the IRS. They'd blown the whistle with the U.S. Attorney's Office. So even as soon as the news came that they were going to talk to Congress, the DOJ kind of freaked out. So that's when you saw the plea deal pushed out for Hunter Biden. Initially, they were going to give him an even sweeter plea deal than the public saw. Originally, there were going to be 0 charges whatsoever. And they said, oh, maybe that doesn't look so good. So they had these kind of misdemeanor charges. And then, of course, so they announced that right as the whistleblower testimony is coming forward. And that's part of what the judge, Mary Ellen Noriega, relied on in saying, this doesn't make sense to grant him this plea deal given all these things. So that plea deal died. And again, I don't think that would have happened were it not for the whistleblowers bringing the truth to light there. So now Hunter has been found guilty in Delaware of gun charges. The DC charges, the statute of limitations was allowed to expire on those. That was one of the things that the IRS whistleblowers raised to Congress. You can't get that back. It's just gone because the DC U.S. attorney, who was appointed by President Biden, didn't want to charge the son of the person who appointed him. Big surprise. And so those charges, the statute of limitations expired. They can never be recovered. And those were the years that included when Hunter Biden received a bunch of money from the Ukrainian energy company Burisma, millions of dollars that he tried to hide from his accountant and from others. All of those tax charges are out the window now. What is going to happen in about a month here, unless there's a new plea deal, is that the case against Hunter in Central District of California will come forward. And that's where you'll really get into the meat of what the IRS agents had uncovered. Now, again, I would not be surprised if the U.S. attorney, who's now a special counsel, David Weiss, if he still concludes a plea agreement. It seems like there was kind of it was clear that his team and Hunter Biden's team last summer, they thought they were going to sweep this under the rug. Then when it all came out in the public, then they had different motivations. Hunter Biden wanted to still protect himself and ask for the world. And so he was asking for immunity from all future things. David Weiss felt like he had at least some shred of reputation to try and preserve. And that's why they said, well, we're not going to give you that kind of immunity. So it was a game of chicken. And obviously Hunter, lost out there because the government charged him after all. Now that Hunter Biden has seen that the government was willing to charge him in Delaware, that he's been convicted, again, I would not be surprised if he comes crawling back to David Weiss and says, okay, we'll take whatever plea deal you'll give us, because I'm sure they do not want to go through with this trial in September. But in the meantime, he's suing the IRS, claiming that me and my co-counsel, claiming that the IRS agents, that we all violated taxpayer secrecy laws. So a lot of our effort right now is going into trying to defend these guys and their reputation, because we did everything by the book to very carefully follow the whistleblower laws and going to Congress And so for Hunter to use that as a tool to just claim these guys broke the law is really just trying to defame them. And it's really unfortunate to see. So we're going to do everything we can to try and help these guys protect their reputation. But, it's very vindictive of him to have filed this lawsuit and to be coming after them, but not a surprise.
And I think you're doing the Lord's work here, but you're also running for your state delegate at the same time. Tell us about your race, which district you're running in, when the election is, and what you're doing there.
Absolutely. So I'm here in the 53rd District of West Virginia. That's here in Charleston, where the Capitol is. We had a primary election back in May, and I won that. And so now in November will be the general election. And so, it's been really a great experience. I will say a lot of my time over the last 13 years since I first finished law school and helped expose ATF's Operation Fast and Furious, working for Chuck Grassley. So much of my time has been digging up scandal after scandal. And, we want to find out, we want to find the problems. And like you say, that's what the founding fathers envisioned, was that, Congress, a lot of it was working for Congress, that they'd be a check on the executive branch. But after a while, you get tired of only seeing problems, right? And so a big part of my motivation here in West Virginia is to help contribute to building things up. Our education system needs some real changes, a real overhaul. We're one of the worst in the nation. There's a lot of addiction. There's a lot of mental illness, mental health challenges. And all of these are areas that I think, the state government can play a role in trying to help. So I'm excited to be a part of that in our state house here. And I think there's a real opportunity to help, improve the quality of life for people, because that at the end of the day is what it's all about, right? Government shouldn't be intruding into everything. The words that I have when you flip on the television are not what the founders intended, right? People should be able to pursue, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And so, having a state government that respects that protects people's freedoms, and that just wants to enable them to be able to succeed and to, prosper. That's what government should be all about. And that's why I'm running. And I'm excited for the impact that I'll be able to have in the state house. There is the election in November, so I will continue campaigning hard, but again, I'm very optimistic about that and look forward to serving in the House of Delegates in January.
And hopefully you'll be able to spark some kind of fire within the state houses across the nation and bring that to D.C. Whether you're going to D.C. as the rep or not, which you're not, but hopefully you can lead by example in exposing the government and keeping them accountable in the ways they ought to be. Is that district currently held by a Democrat or a Republican? Because it's near Charleston. I know that's more a liberal part of West Virginia.
That's right. It's held by a Republican. He ran for Secretary of State and wasn't successful in that. And then he actually ran for the Senate after that, the state Senate. So it's an open seat, but it is kind of on the outskirts a little bit. So it's more red, more of a Republican district. So my odds are pretty good. But again, at the end of the day, I want to be able to help, not just get elected and just sit there, right? I mean, as you say, I'm a big believer in accountability and in transparency. In my view, that's how you get accountability. And a lot of fellow Republicans don't really, because those on the left tend to be a lot more protective of like employee rights. They're a lot more focused on that. I'm just a big advocate for Republicans understanding if you want to find waste, fraud, and abuse, if you want to drain the swamp, if you care about these things, you've got to believe in transparency. You've got to protect whistleblowers. And so I'm excited to be an advocate for that, like you said, not only in the state house, but again, across the nation, because we need more people caring about those issues.
That's 100% right. I hear there's a bit of a leadership problem going on in the West Virginia Congress there. So I hope you can join my buddy Elias and help actually do some real work in West Virginia. Because really, West Virginia could pass a lot of bills that the nation should be passing. So start that spark there in West Virginia. I've got one final question for you, Tristan. I like to close every interview with this question, give some kind of commonality throughout. But if you could tell America, or my generation, one thing not to give up, what would it be?
Religious freedom, to me, is the most important thing, because at the end of the day, your rights to pray, to worship as you will, right? That's so foundational. And in a lot of countries, that's one of the things that falls by the wayside, right? So even freedom of speech, some of the biggest advocates for that at the time of the founding, and even some of the biggest supporters of the American Revolution, they were pastors, they were preachers, right? They were people who understood the centrality of someone's conviction. And as a person of faith myself, I think that it's so critical that we don't let that fall out of public life, because when we do, of course, we see freedom of speech fall by the wayside. Of course, we see freedom of the press fall by the wayside, because all of these, the thing that drove that over so many centuries was, again, freedom of religion. That's what brought so many of the original individuals here to this land to seek the ability to worship. And so to me, that's one of the most precious things we can protect. And protecting that helps ensure that so many of our other freedoms are protected as well.
I think you're 100% right. America was founded for a moral people. I mean, look no further than the Pilgrims. I mean, that's the foundation of our nation. We want to save it. Have to return to that. So, Tristan, where can we find you on social media? Where can we find your work with Empower Oversight? Where's it all at?
Yeah, so on X and Instagram, a number of places, I'm just Tristan Leavitt, Leavitt. EmpowerOversight.com, EmpowerOversight.org is our nonprofit website, and Empower also has accounts on X as well. And so there's a lot of information out there. We're big believers in bringing facts to people. So if you like reading a lot, right, then this is a place to go, because we try to provide as much information as we can to the public about the ways that we need reform in our government.
I love it. Keep doing the Lord's work, Tristan. It's been great having you.
Thanks so much for having me, Christian. Appreciate you.